Because physicians are not embracing these technologies as fast as their patients, we are entering this tsunami period. And it is, if it's not already starting to show up, and I think it's coming, and look out. Where the average patient's gonna walk in armed with so much intelligence that they're gonna make the average physician seem wrong. If 600,000 people die a year in the US of cancer, if 100,000 can be saved by being on the right therapy, I think another 100,000 can be saved by us testing which therapies might work using these kind of models.
Welcome to AI in Healthcare. My name is Dr. Sanjay Juneja. I'm a hematologist and medical oncologist, also known as the Onc Doc on news and social media. And I am joined by my co-host, Dr. Douglas Flora, who's a medical oncologist. He is the executive director of St. Elizabeth's and the chief editor of AI and Precision Oncology. And Doug, our guest today, your exact words when I sought some advice from you, like I often do, was, that is a man that you want to spend any bit of time around if you can. And the word you used was visionary. So if you could kind of tell our listeners, well, who do we have today and why you're excited?
Well, thanks, Sanjay, for the handoff. And Eric, thank you for doing this. You are a personal hero of mine. So this is a fun day for me. We're going to have an insightful conversation. But for the audience who may not know you somehow, our guest founded Tempus AI, a company that, in my opinion, has arguably done more than any other single organization to turn cancer data from a liability into a weapon against cancer. And Eric, like me, your story we'll get into, I'm sure, why you did this. And I've read it many times. I've heard you talk about your wife's experience and your experience where we were essentially flying blind. And so I credit you with doing something rather than nothing. And it's going to be important for our audience to understand where that passion has come from for you. 10 years later, now Tempus connects to nearly half of the U.S. hospitals, sequences more cancer patients than any other company in the country, and is growing in leaps and bounds as a business. So congratulations for that. I'll also put in there for the latter part, also co-founded Pathos AI, which is pursuing very ambitious bets in precision oncology that we'll get into. But Eric, today we're going to go somewhere I don't think you get to go in your financial analyst calls. I want to go a little bit deeper into the biology and the philosophy. And the hard questions about whether any of this is going to change outcomes for the patient in front of us. And I can tell you, Sanjay and I we are drinking the Kool-Aid. So I am as optimistic as I've ever been. And I just want to welcome you to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, and I think the best place to start is really what first got not only my interest, but my passion, which was this concept of cancer care almost looking like a global data coordination problem that's maybe disguised as a medical problem. Eric, I'm curious, what do you think the healthcare system fundamentally misunderstood for decades about the role of data as it relates to oncology and cancer care delivery?
Yeah, I mean, I think they misunderstood it over the past several decades. That one could argue that they still misunderstand it to a large extent today. I think that the challenge in healthcare more broadly, but certainly in cancer care more granularly, is that we just have never needed to bring technology or data science or big data into the practice of medicine, because it really served no core function. So first of all, up until cancer in the US, there weren't very, very large multimodal data sets that could be interpreted to really dramatically improve care. It took sequencing the human genome 20 plus years ago. It took that getting to a low enough cost that it became pretty pervasive. It took a variety of drugs that were influenced by that molecular data and a kind of vastness of potential permutations that made it so that, hey, if I had technology or big data or data science, it could actually help steer patients in a better path than without that. And I think up until this moment of time, you could argue that just really wasn't necessary. The practice of medicine was either far more of an art and that rested on kind of experience, or the guidelines and pathways were known by people with expertise, or it involved kind of the deep biology and chemistry disciplines that are kind of studied in medical school, or it involved a series of like mechanical practices like surgery that again are like you learn it and you can do it and it has an outcome, but you just didn't need like AI to treat patients. And I think what's happening now is we have a system in the U.S. that by its nature allows for a tremendous amount of freedom, unlike other systems outside the U.S. where that freedom doesn't exist. You have enormous amounts of data, and the combination of that data and that freedom mean we have the ability to actually use AI and other machine learning tools to help steer patients to the right therapeutic path. And unfortunately, the wrong therapeutic path, which could be wrong for a variety of reasons. Typically, it's just no one knows it's the wrong path. Otherwise, nobody would put their patient on the wrong path. But the patient being on the wrong path, we think accounts for about, give or take, roughly, let's say 20% of all fatalities in the U.S. So maybe you could save 100,000 people, 120,000 people a year from dying if we had a system that was using all the information we had and routing people to the right therapeutic, closing care gaps, ensuring the people who should be on trials were on trial, all that good stuff. If you had that system, we think you can probably eliminate maybe 1 in every 5 cancer deaths. You can't get to the other, I don't think, 75 or 80% without a whole variety of other stuff. But our main focus at Tempus is to be that system and reduce those deaths.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to Razik, who is the CEO of Page, before he teamed up with Tempus, and I was explaining to him, Razik, like, we almost just want to be wrong less. I'm like, everything sounds glamorous and sexy with being like, oh, we can hit it on the target, this, that, and the other. But I'm like, at the end of the day, my wife and I, when we practice, there's nothing that hits you in the gut worse than like, being bullish or excited about something and then it failing. And it knocks the wind out so much that, the one time that the EGFR positive lung cancer patient just progressed straight through it, I was never as enthusiastic again, because I don't like, for that minority of the case, I just didn't want that to happen. And that happens in a lot of things to a lot, greater statistical amount than you would see with EGFR positivity. And when you look at and think about different industries, you think about how every interaction usually improves the system. But in oncology, and this is kind of what I believe you're saying, a patient can go through an entire treatment journey and everything they got and didn't get and progressed and didn't and toxic and didn't and what was their germline stuff. And yet almost none of that experience of that particular patient's journey meaningfully updates care for the next patient in real time. And what I mean by that, or sometimes I think about it, is, trying to explain 5FU to patients. And I'm like, look, we give you a bolus and we kind of, slam some drug into you, and that's why you come back and get it later. And then we realized you can wear it and kind of give a slow dose over time. We have this very bolus-oriented way of delivery. It's like, we're going to do something, we learn something, now everyone's going to get that, regardless of what happens in the interval, until we can update it. What had to change technologically for oncology to finally become, or ultimately become, a continuously learning system in real time, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the things that we are doing at Tempus and the things that I think other people are doing, which is essentially, if you think about it, you would need to generate a tremendous amount of diagnostic data that could serve as a target. So in this case, that's molecular data. It's basically next generation sequencing data. And we could DNA, RNA, methylation. You got to generate the data. Then you'd need to be able to collect the clinical data for those patients to see what's happening. Are they responding? Then you would need to have enough kind of underlying compute capabilities that you could make sense of all this data. Because it isn't like 100 targets and 100 responses. It's millions of permutations that are very hard to see. And so I've long said Tempus is the beneficiary of a variety of background technologies that began with kind of the ability to process molecular files at low cost. That came from companies like Illumina, a low cost cloud and compute that came from companies like Amazon and whatever. A whole bunch of really cool technologies like natural language processing and optical character recognition that came from others. Now, large language models and large multimodal models that really were developed for a whole bunch of consumer use cases that we benefit from. But all these background technologies, kind of interestingly, are really ideal for taking messy, unstructured, very complicated data, and now being able to, for the first time ever, see patterns and response in that data using neural networks, using the same technologies that allow us to basically ask ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude all kinds of complex questions and get an intelligent response. And so I think the ingredients are there. And I suspect what will happen is, it kind of takes a long time for all this stuff to get to scale, and then all of a sudden you start to see all these amazing insights and applications that come from that, and then you get adoption pretty quickly thereafter. I think we're exiting the stage of this journey where we've been building these background technologies and amassing the data, entering the stage where we're going to start to generate over the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years, a tremendous amount of insight that only could have existed by virtue of these systems. And then you'll see adoption quite quickly thereafter.
That's part of the Eric isms that I love. So I read everything you write. I love your pieces, but something that appealed specifically to me as somebody who likes to talk in analogies is you're talking about laying cable. Before we had MTV, before we had HBO, and I've seen what you guys have been building over the last probably 4 or 5 years, accelerating because the technology's finally caught up with what you wanted to build.
Yeah.
And you can start to connect these silos. So maybe for our audience that hasn't read all your stuff and who doesn't stalk you online like I do as a tech nerd, can you talk about that analogy so people understand what you mean when you talk about the foundations that you've been doing to connect these hospitals and unstructured clinical data, predictive models?
Yeah. I mean, you could pick an industry, like there's a bunch of different analogies I think are good. The one that I have used in the past is, and I'm old enough to remember a world of basically 3 television stations.
Me too.
A lot of people, I'm sure, listening to this can't remember that world. And literally, I remember them digging up my neighborhood, and I'm like, what are they doing? And they were laying cable to my home and every other home, and that allowed companies to distribute not just 3 television stations, but eventually hundreds and thousands, and really was the precursor to this content revolution that created now the world we live in, right? We found other ways to distribute the programming to people's homes. You have the internet, you have satellites and the like, but all these things were necessary to live in a world where I've got Netflix and Hulu and Disney Plus and blah, 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 and I can watch anything everywhere all the time, anywhere. And so it's the same thing. If you would have said to somebody in 1978, like that world's going to exist, they'd have laughed at you. It'd been like, there have been 3, NBC, CBS, ABC, that's it for the last 30 years, like, get out of here. And yet here we are today, and that's the world we live in. And I think it's the same thing. You have to kind of do the legwork to, in this case, get data en masse in one place at scale. So for a company like ours, that means generating the data you need if you don't have it, pulling data out of the system where somebody else has it, getting it in one place, investing in being able to understand that data and harmonize it, building the compute infrastructure environment that would allow you to generate insights at scale. And then when you have those insights, put them back in the hands of doctors. And so that two-way highway of data coming out of healthcare providers, generating some kind of machine learning or AI insight, and the insight going back into the hands of those same providers is the foundation that we've been working on for the past decade. It exists at real scale, but it's still, I would say, maybe, we're 20% of the way there. Not only do we have to finish connecting to the other hospitals we don't connect to, we connect to about 5,500 hospitals. There's roughly 8,000 or 9,000. So we've got some work to do to get to the hospitals we don't connect to. But you also want to connect not just in oncology, but in all the major disease areas. And so there's quite a bit of work to be done. But I do believe that in the near term, we'll live in a world where we can produce AI enabled or enhanced clinical insights in real time or near real time, and deliver them into the U.S. healthcare system in a way that reduces error at scale and makes sure that all decisions that are made are really high quality data driven decisions, And I think that's the next big unlock.
Eric, I want to thank you for making me feel very old in the first 5 minutes of our broadcast today. It's because I remember that cable for Sanjay, who was not even an ember then.
I was the remote control. I remember being young, and my dad would say, "Go, I'm on the couch. Go change to channel 4," and I'd come back. Go change to channel 7. Kids were the remote control.
And adjust the antennas. I did live in an era where I had to kind of move those around. So Eric, you illustrated this beautiful idea of this flywheel is a term I've heard you use often, and I hope that can help people appreciate why perhaps things have felt slower than usual. And one of the biggest criticisms I got, not me personally, but on behalf of the oncology community online, on social media, was a lot of comments like, yeah, I just believe sometimes it's a money-making thing because there's so much, there's this aggregate of tragedy, an aggregate of poor outcomes, an aggregate of unfavorable responses, and ain't nothing happening. Or you get about 13 to 15 months. And part of the reason for that, just by the way you painted it, is because there isn't this continuous inputting of everything that's happening. All this aggregate of unfavorable outcome is not being quantified. It's not being extracted. It's not being harmonized. It's not being harmonized and then put into machine learning models that can make sense of it and say, oh, this might be the whats and the whys. He's Indian, and that's why they don't seem to respond to this. We can finally come to a place where we can in real time have that stuff, or near real time, have it populated and start having insights in a machine learning fashion. And I think one of the cool things that I heard once is yes, there's going to be all kinds of algorithms and machine learning models, but the latency by which we did things before, like where you had this bolus, pulsation. We're going to take a lot of data, look at it, extract it, apply our scientists, come up with some guidelines. Okay, keep doing everything, see how it changes. And then maybe 3, 6, 9 months later, when a trial happens, we'll do another one. And that's now sped up because you can actually just pick a week to week on data and say, I want to investigate this, or as an institution, I want to look into see what's happening today since our guidelines updated 3 months ago in this particular situation, if there's something more to be found. So there's that aspect of it. Now, the second aspect that I've only recently appreciated, thanks to you and in the last year and a half, is the number of stakeholders. Like, I came from a place of practice in a community setting where I didn't even know what stakeholder meant. And now, you think about all of the people that are not voluntary, but necessary to actually have better treatment one day. And that's going to be, of course, providers that deliver the care. It's going to be the pharma industry that can develop these things. It's diagnostics. It's researchers that can give it to potentially pharma to be able to develop these things. It's payers to be able to say, what level of comfort am I okay with real world evidence or data to be able to put this thing in the wild and see if it works. And then, of course, it's manufacturers. And I just feel like a lot of them were disconnected and also had their own latency of sorts. And I would argue that you kind of brought all of these positions also into a rotation of sorts that I think is rather challenging to explain to somebody. I would love to know, how do you think that the connected data aspect, that first flywheel that we talked about, has changed the relationship now between these stakeholders that they may have been used to in the past in this more bolus fashion?
Yeah, I think it's, look, not as much as you would think, which is kind of crazy. The three of us, I think, are aligned on technology's impact in oncology and broader healthcare, and we're believers. And we're optimistic, and so we're over here on this side of the spectrum. But in reality, there's still 50% of oncologists, based on a recent study that I thought was kind of fascinating, that aren't even pervasively sequencing their patients, if sequencing them at all. Meaning they're not even sure genomic profiling matters, even though it is literally up and down the guidelines. You can't go, more than 3 pages without essentially hitting a biomarker. And so I think we just still live in a world where the challenge that we're having is it's too easy for people to say, great, sequencing patients, whatever, but it doesn't have that much of an impact. Like, at the end of the day, if I do this thing or don't do this thing, it's only a 6-month extension of life. And I'm not even sure I'm helping my patient because maybe I'm giving them a drug that makes the quality of their life worse. And we see that same thing with MRD. I'll run into doctors today who are like, I'm not ordering it. Why? I'm not convinced it really adds value. I think a scan is good enough, and I think this whole thing's kind of a waste. And you hear this a lot, and it's crazy. You hear it from super smart people. It's not just shared among It's not like it's, oh, the smart people are all doing it. And, it's not that at all. It's that you just have a generation of people that don't believe. And unfortunately, the challenge of a lot of these new technologies that have entered oncology is they are more targeted in nature than personalized, and they haven't had the massive impact that people would have thought it would have had 20 years ago. If I would have said to you on the day we sequenced the human genome, tell me what cancer care is like in the year 2026, you probably would have painted a picture very different than this picture today. And so I try to tell people, like, that's not the fault of, it doesn't mean this is all wrong. Like, we're 100% right. It's just you have to calibrate your timing. Elon Musk, very clearly was wrong in whether or not autonomous driving vehicles would be possible and pervasive. He was off by probably 7 to 10 years. But I'm telling you, as a guy who drives a Tesla, that thing drives itself. Like, it's unbelievable, right? You can plug in an address, and honestly, it's like kind of wild. So it's the same thing here. We're 100% right. But moving this, and by the way, remember, like, self-driving cars is one system. The US healthcare system is another. That system is, like, honestly quite tiny. This system is massive and regulated because it's like massive and regulated. So it's a very difficult system to move. It's taken a long time to both sequence patients at scale, generate these bodies of evidence of where it matters and how it matters, have all these background technologies that allow us to learn in real time, that allow us to take real world data and actually make it useful. So I think what again, like this, everything that's happened in the past decade or two is going to seem really slow to what happens in the next decade, which will seem really slow to what happens in the decade after that. And that's the part of the curve that you're at, which is we're gonna all of a sudden flood the system with all kinds of real world data insights. Both of you, everyone like you who's treating patients and willing to like embrace new information, you will flock to these tools because you will be like, I don't want to be wrong. I don't want to put my patient on an EGFR inhibitor if somebody's out there telling me my patient has a 10% chance of responding and a 90% chance of not responding. And if I do put him on an inhibitor, I want to bring him back in 60 days and get him on a different therapy instead of 6 months. You will deliver better care, and the whole system will start to like move very quickly to people who are embracing these technologies. And so I think it's going to go from like, another analogy would be the internet. Like, I mean, I lived through it. We were, as somebody who's launching companies, the internet in 98, 99, you could go to places like JCPenney in Plano, Texas, or Sears in Hoffman Estates, Illinois, and they're like, this thing's a joke. It's silly. It's a waste of time. And then like literally 10 years after that, if they didn't have an internet strategy, they were almost out of business. And it's the same thing here. It takes a long time for this thing to build up, and then the bubble. The bubble burst, but not in a bad way. The bubble actually bursts in a good way. You get real adoption.
Yeah, it's so funny that you say that, Eric. I have to say this because this morning my wife was excitedly telling me, she's like, hey, remember this patient that you had for about a year, small cell lung cancer, stage 4. And she was like, we're a year and a half out and still has like, complete, CR radiographically on immune therapy with her stage 4 small cell. And I was like, oh, did you get MRD on her? And rightfully so, because being an oncology practice, she's thinking guidelines. She's like, why would I get MRD on her? Like, radiographs are great. We know where the disease was. I was like, because there's something about this that could have tipped us off. I'm like, when we digitize those slides and when we look at the tumor microenvironment, when I look at the signatures and see what the allelic variants were, to see there has to be some way we can identify this patient again in the future for them to have a 2.5 year, a radiographic CR based on just monotherapy with immune therapy. And that was the excitement, which that's the justified odds. There's one that's like, I was never a researcher per se, and my wife, short of, getting into medical school and fellowship. But now we need to almost, I feel like, be a little more responsible to embracing that as clinical oncologists, because we actually have a real-time investigative process, which is otherwise known as real-world data, because it can be harmonized and interrogated. I don't know if you, I know you feel the same way, Doug, but it was just so interesting that was an explanation I had to walk, through this morning.
So Eric, this is, I think, one of the things that I love the way you bang the drum, and you are obviously hyper articulate and highly intelligent, but the things that you're talking about resonate with me as a doctor, because I think the naysayers, maybe that if you put Sanjay and I in that early adopter or bell curve thing, I think the other 13.5% are getting there, but the naysayers are the ones who are out there saying it makes too many mistakes. Just like we talk about full self-driving. I love my Tesla. And if you look at it, the most dangerous thing I can do in my car near an automobile accident is touch the wheel, right? I can't do calculus as fast as my car can with its 13 cameras. The oncologist, I want those of you who are out here, and this is why we do this podcast, by the way, is we want to curate this content that makes you challenge your assumptions, is that it's not AI versus the best oncologist at the best academic ivory tower question that we're asking of AI. It's fallible. It's new. It's early innings, like you've said, Eric. But it's, can the AI allow us to practice a version of medicine versus the actual standard of care a patient in this county will receive this month? And I think that's where the three of us would probably all agree that the rate limiter in AI and health right now is no longer model capability. The models are great, and they're getting better by the hour. Not even the economics of it anymore. It's a speed of trust building. And so I think for Eric, as you build this megalith that you've built, this gigantic machine, I think that's not a bug to work around. It's the product. Whoever can make trust building faster, not necessarily capability faster, in my opinion, is going to win healthcare. And I think you guys have been off to the races because you're building trust with the clinicians in the field. So, your field teams talk about this a lot, about being partners instead of being vendors. I don't know where you got that. That probably didn't come from the Groupon days.
I do think it's a symbiotic relationship. I think it is. You have to be. You can't just kind of come at this with a one size fits all and here's what you got to do. I also think trust is complicated because these systems are going to be fallible, and so it's just too easy for people that don't want to trust to build a body of evidence as to why they shouldn't trust. I think it's a bit like this is a really kind of a interesting way to think about it. I think, which is about 10 years ago ish, there was Apple put out a really interesting study about digital pathology and neural networks, and essentially the study was that pathologists in the United States were about on average, say 10% wrong. They had 10% error. So what they did is they took a large body of slides and they built an AI tool to basically classify the slides from a kind of a anatomic pathology perspective, make all the calls. And then they took a bunch of humans, and then they took a third group, which was both. And what they found is, amazingly, the humans were like 90% accurate, 10% inaccurate, which is, I think, maybe even to this day, still roughly national average. The machines were about 90% accurate, 10% inaccurate. But the combination of both was 99% accurate, 1% inaccurate. And what they found is that the machines were very good at kind of quantification problems where humans had a problem, and the humans were very good at qualitative problems where the machines had a problem. And now today, unfortunately, for the pathologists, the tools have gotten so good that I think they probably the machines are now amazingly well, even without the humans. But I think what's going to happen in oncology, and it's a much more complicated problem, much harder to just throw compute at it, is you're going to enter this period, instead of it being, let's say, a decade before the machines get really good, let's call it 50 years, or 100 years. It's some period of time like that, where it's going to take AI plus human to really treat patients well. And so, there's a shortage of physicians in the year 2026. I think we're short something like 1 million care team members across the compendium. I would bet you a lot of money we're short 1 million in the year 2050. The only people that shouldn't worry about their job is physicians. There's no scenario I can see where that skill set is not going to be needed, in large part because there's a contextualization here that is just really, really, really hard. And that's just on the physiological side, the phenotypic side. When you get to the emotional side, that's a whole nother layer that probably takes us another 25 or 50 years to tackle. So I think doctors who are worried that AI is trying to replace them, there are certainly companies trying to replace providers for certain functions. That's a fact. Like there are people that are like, you don't need to order your GLP-1 inhibitor or your erectile dysfunction medication by seeing a doctor. Call me and I'll take care of it. Whether that's good or bad, we could debate it. But in terms of like complex disease, heart attack, cancer, stroke, immunological disorders, the tricky stuff, things you need a hospital for, I think physicians should feel very secure in their place in the ecosystem. And what they really should do, I think you mentioned this a few minutes ago, is just try, how do you embrace technology to go from being a good doctor to a great doctor, from making some number of mistakes to fewer mistakes. And it's not that you were wrong, it's that you just didn't have the tools to make what would have been a better decision for that patient. And I think if we can, and it's really going to take that marriage to solve these problems. And unfortunately, because physicians are not embracing these technologies as fast as their patients, we are entering, and I have talked about this a lot, this tsunami period. And it is, if it's not already starting to show up, and I think it's coming, and look out, where the average patient's going to walk in armed with so much intelligence that they're going to make the average physician seem wrong a lot. And this system is not set up for that. This system is set up to say, I'm the expert, you're the patient, don't question me. And unfortunately, I can take my medical records and load them into chat. I'll give you a great example. And this happens all the time. I will have physician will say something, okay? And they'll say it with unbelievable, as if it's just a fact. Like this is undisputable, okay? And even and I will go into Gemini or chat and I'll start asking questions and you find out it's totally wrong. It's completely wrong. Now the problem is 10 years ago, a physician could say that there was no way to know that. But now there's a way to know it. And so the system has to change. And I think you're just going to have I've said this all the time, when the average bus driver walks in as if he or she was with 100 of the top physicians in the world who spent 1,000 hours on her case or his case, and you're a doctor seeing 40 patients that day, and you spent 5 minutes on this case, you are ill prepared for the tsunami that's coming at you. And it's going to show up in primary care. It'll show up in the subspecialties after that at scale. And we're not doing enough to help our physicians be prepared for that. Open evidence is not the solution.
Yeah, I mean, there are over 300 to 350,000 apps now that are health consumer apps, DTC, direct to patient, where you're able to truly just connect your records and be able to get all kinds of deep, insights and information based on your actual data. So I keep saying this too when I'm speaking, is we need to be prepared as institutions, if nothing else, even in the capacity of taking care of all those pap smears that weren't followed up when it said recommend, repeat in 6 months, or all of the nodules. We know what a mess that's been when it comes to pulmonary nodules and incidentals, how hard it has been to not just to locate them, but then to actually follow them up and implement these workflows. And all of this stuff is coming quickly on the horizon. But I loved what you said about the emotional aspect too. And I think one good example of that, I personally hate having adjuvant therapy conversations, especially when they're on the fringe. So one good example is a stage 2 colorectal cancer that you're supposed to look at the high risk features, and if they have it, then okay, do I give intense chemotherapy? I mean, chemotherapy has its risk both during and long term, afterward. And I'm look, based on the clinical features, you have an X percentage of chance of benefiting from chemotherapy, even though you're stage 2. And one interesting example of how AI can be complementary is Paige, the pathology company, the AI company, was able to do basically investigation with an NCI institute, designated institute, and they were able to look at embeddings based on the digitized slides of all of the people that got colon cancer and who ended up benefiting from therapy versus having recurrence. And when you took, and only when you took, those embeddings and those insights that came from the digitized slides, plus the clinical features I'm using myself, then you went up from a 76 to 78% accuracy on who benefited from chemotherapy to like 83, 84%. So it wasn't miraculous. It didn't get to 100, but I'm wrong less. And I can be more assured that if I'm going to subject somebody to something that I could potentially sustain moral injury from because of a poor outcome, because of permanent neuropathy, cold neuropathy, I have a way to be at least more sure that it is the right decision today. And I think there's going to be a significant period of time where that's what this world looks like, well before something's just telling us what to do.
It's going to be even I think more complicated than that for the average oncologist, which is I'm about to kind of give you a whole litany of information on all these specialties you don't interact with: cardiology, neurology, immunology, where we're going to be able to say to you, like, hey, you could give the patient this particular medication, but you're probably going to mess with their antidepressant. And now all of a sudden you have to be like, whoa, wait a minute. Now I got to weigh. you were just trying to weigh like adverse events. What happens if I give you like 34 adverse events? And you're like, wait a minute. Okay, how do I think about a 10% increased chance of neuropathy? Let's say national average is 4. I'm going to go to 14. It's a material risk versus an 88% chance that this patient is going to have to change antidepressants. And I've got now a cycle of 2 or 3 years of sleeplessness and weight loss. And then what happens there? Can they not take their chemotherapy? Are they going to have to go up? So we're going to just start to throw all this at you. And without technology to say, okay, this drug, that drug, this adverse event, that adverse event, this, let's weigh it all together. And now what do you recommend? And I'll kind of start from that. And this is basically, if you think about it, what happened with radar. That's what pilots do. They have a plot. They have a course plotted for them based upon traffic and weather. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, 1 billion permutations that you could never, ever, like you, as a human, you would never get it right. And then you're like, okay, that's great, but I'm going to fly a little bit this way or a little bit that way because, it's bumpy up here or whatever it is, or I got judgment or I've seen, and that's what we need to do. We need to arm physicians with radar.
It's so funny you say that too about the sleep, because we just had a specialist, nationally known, just to talk about this sleep's effect and the circadian rhythm genes on cancer therapy responses. That's going to be immediately at a patient's hand. It's like, yo, I'm not sleeping because of the interleukins and cytokines that are going into my CNS that are disrupting my sleep, which is why high volume disease and cancer therapy causes problems. And then now they're going to be like, so I need proper management that doesn't affect my REM cycle, because we know what it does in the immune system, which we know is relevant in the function of this cancer drug. Like, that is a very real reality of at least the information accessibility that's immediately present today. And it's just kind of wild to think about.
That's not so. I mean, that's on us, the people that are out there, again, banging the drum to make sure the right story is being told. So Eric, that's where I think you can help a lot with your platform. And what people are rebelling against ignores the misuse of AI. So it's all the downstream stuff. What if the Tesla wrecks, not the number of wrecks averted, right? We have Waymo data saying that's a 92% reduction in automobile accidents, but my wife still won't let my Tesla drive us. She's a very data-driven person. So I think the storytellers out there that are curating this information for the 19,000 oncologists out there struggling with this, we need to talk about what the damage is done when you're not doing next generation sequencing routinely. Right? When you're not sending the right match specimens, when you're not using MRD to de-escalate colon cancer adjuvant therapies or bladder cancer adjuvant therapies. And so for me, the moral injury that Sanjay and I always talk about is, how do we make the case for the goodness that's coming and not just the risk to jobs and not all the doomsayers about all the things that may or may not come to pass, but what about the deaths that we are averting because a pathology slide got read better? A lung nodule was picked up earlier. A patient was spared that neuropathy that we're talking about because she got on the right therapy, because she was identified to have a very specific pathogenic mutation that's not being looked at in Appalachia right now. And I think that's the power of the template that you're building, is it will let the physician, as the chef, taste the food at the end of the line, to go back to that old Atul Gawande Cheesecake Factory article. But everything else before that takes chance and accident and happenstance out of the equation as much as possible. And I don't know how physicians can't get behind that. I honestly don't. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here.
I've long thought, I mean, look, I don't know how you can accelerate it. I know you guys are obviously, it's one of the missions of this program is to try to accelerate that. So I think it's a noble effort. I don't know how much of an impact any one group can have, because it's just such a big system, and it's going to move at the pace it moves. It's literally like turning the Titanic. Even though I don't think this is like hitting an iceberg, but it's like turning a giant ship. And I think the way that I think it ultimately gets turned, whether you can speed it up 20% or whatever, but the way it ultimately gets turned is, you build products that are worthy of adoption, and they get adopted, and behavior gets changed. So if you think about our experience for a moment with OpenAI, they built a product that was worthy of adoption, and it got adoption, and then it forced everyone else to build similar products, whether that's Anthropic or Google or whoever. And now I would guess, most people like the three of us are using these tools multiple times a week, if not multiple times a day. Okay. I'm using them to answer questions. It's now the way I search the internet more often than not. So they get adoption quickly. And I think the question that all of us have to ask is, part of it is obviously why are some physicians slow to embrace innovation and change? But an equal question that I think is worth asking the diagnostic companies like Tempus is, when are you going to create a series of products that are so good that they can't not be adopted? And it's on both of us, right? You guys have to push your side, and we have to continue to make the products better. And I do suspect they will converge. I would bet if I'm back on this program, 5 years from now, and we're having this conversation, it's like, oh my God, can you believe the last 5 years? And it's because some combination of all these efforts tipped the snowball to kind of go very quick down the mountain.
Yeah, just like very focal catalysts. One of those things that I get excited about that we just don't hear nearly enough about, that I guess I can't be surprised was already on your radar, is this concept that for the first time we can begin modeling aspects of an individual's patient's tumor biology, not just like inside the body, but outside the body, to know what's going to happen inside the body in ways that can be functionally, or at least feel like they're going to be functionally meaningful and not just descriptive. And that's this whole concept of organoids. So can you tell us what excites you about organoids? And is this an early bridge towards this whole, digital twins in oncology, where you can almost twin virtually, not just the tumor, but even the, homeostatic, series of events around that tumor for the patient themselves, because we know that there's different factors. What does that all look like and play out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think AI is going to have a big impact on all these different components within healthcare. I think it's going to completely re-engineer diagnostics. Diagnostics in the future will kind of all be AI enabled, so they'll be personalized and contextualized and really intelligent. I think drug discovery and development is going to be influenced by AI. I think you're just going to not, develop drugs the old way. You're going to have all this artificial intelligence helping you figure out how to design drugs, how to design clinical trials, how to enroll patients, how to ensure that these trials are going to be successful and the right patients are going to get the right drug. And I think AI is going to completely allow this entire space of functional genomics that really has been stuck behind a wall to kind of come to the foreground. And for those that don't know, what that basically means is, can we essentially test in a biological setting what you might respond to as a patient outside your body, but in a way that's representative of what's going to occur inside your body. So it's essentially using a synthetic guinea pig, for lack of a better word, as opposed to you as the patient being the guinea pig, which is the way so much of trial and error works today. Whether that's getting an antidepressant, a diabetes medication, or a life-saving cancer therapy. We just don't know, so that the doc does his or her best at picking what they think is the right first choice. And when that doesn't work, the second choice. When that doesn't work, the third choice. You hope you eventually get it right. And we now possess the capability to build biological models at your disease or that are representative of your biology outside of your body. And then in theory, over time, AI will help us make those models better and will help us screen those models to figure out what's the right therapeutic. I suspect at its extreme, over the next decade or two, this will be the real scale where we will be able to grow these models very efficiently and be able to test, thousands of permutations in real time. And so I would not be surprised if you kind of break it down, let's just use cancer as an example. If 600,000 people die a year in the US of cancer, if 100,000 can be saved by being on the right therapy, I think another 100,000 can be saved by us testing which therapies might work using these kind of models. Because that isn't a mistake. We're not making a mistake. There you're actually trying to make a prediction that is very complicated to make. And so we think a lot about helping advance that infrastructure. There's ways you could do that. Cell lines would be one way, microfluidics another, xenografts, which are mouse models, a third. We've chosen organoids because we think it's a really interesting representation of kind of cancer biology, and that we can grow these little mini tumors that have the microenvironment surrounding it, and then kind of attack them with various drugs that you might, as a doctor, order and see how the patient responds. It's early. If next generation sequencing, after let's say a decade of scale, is now just entering a period where it's going to be really highly useful, you can imagine this is a decade behind that. So we're still very, very early, and there's no kind of economic model that makes this make sense. But the coolest part of a company like Tempus is we have an economic model that does make sense today, right? We sequence patients, we get paid by insurance, we license the identified data and help drug companies get paid by them. So we have this economic model that allows us to make all kinds of investments that are non-economical, like the significant investments we make in growing organoids and building these biological models that I think are going to pay dividends one day, but it's early.
I'm fascinated by this stuff. My daughter's a third-year med student, Eric, and her research is in organoids. She's doing head and neck cancer and Keytruda sensitivity in mice and transplanting little tumorlets into mice. So I've been hearing a lot about this in my house. Let me play a game with you. I know you do these things all the time because I've watched a lot of them. Let me put you the spot on a fun question. Is we got about 10 minutes left, Sanjay. If we fast forward 10 years, what part of oncology will we look back, the three of us, will look the most primitive in hindsight because of AI and connected data? That same third-year med student is flabbergasted at some of the things that I used to do to people as a brand new baby oncologist in 2005. The same way that Sanjay was flabbergasted when we talked about digging lines for cable and the remote control being the 8-year-old. What do you think is going to be primitive when we look back? We'll just shake our head and say, man, that's the best we had at the time.
Yeah, I think by far, it's going to be this idea that in the year 2026, we're making all kinds of decisions based on intuition and trial and error. And in the year 2036, you would make none of those decisions. So it's literally going to be like radar, no radar, GPS, no GPS. It will feel like, again, I don't know, Sanjay, we grew up in a world where, you'd get in a car, okay, and you were going to ask somebody along the way where to get to. You were going to pull over and be like, hey, I'm trying to go here, or buy a map somewhere. So, and then that world went away, and now you're like, what? Why would you ask a stranger where to go? That's crazy.
They talk in north, south, east, and west, and no one knows what that means. Yeah.
Same thing. We will arm physicians, oncologists, radiologists, everyone treating cancer patients. Will arm them with this kind of totality of data that says, knowing everything we know about this patient, which is kind of everything in the medical record, here's the statistical probability of success. If you do X, Y, Z, on and on, you can choose, but we'll do all the hard math for you. So the trial and error and gut intuition is gone. And that's the biggest distinction. Oncologists will still be making decisions, but they will never make them without this kind of AI GPS providing them the coordinates.
Like this level of security. And that just seems like such a haven, a holy haven to be able to get to, because I think that is where a lot of this moral injury is sustained and what weighs my wife down, when the best she has to make an informed decision is looking at 60-40 and being wrong 40% of the time at best. And that's very optimistic. If I may, Eric, I would like to ask you a little bit of a harder question. And I think you're very uniquely positioned to be able to answer this. Doug has made me read enough books by now when it comes to business and entrepreneur stuff to really appreciate how, a capitalistic environment can be catalytic to innovation and to, really cool things that come out of it. Like there's something intrinsic to that can lead to success. Do you believe, and I think that is a big reason to why we've had a lot of the advancement we have today in cancer care. But now that we have this overwhelming amount of data and the technologic ability, not fully accessible and democratized, but more accessible than it used to be, how does this whole conversation or thought about having federated models or, open access stuff, like to have foundation models applied to it versus what we're seeing in the headline, which are just billion-dollar contracts of relationships. Do you think that same sentiment still applies to where that is by principle what's going to lead to an accelerated amount of innovation? Or at some point, do you feel I could see that the tide needs to shift and we just need to have this all open for humanity because somebody's smarter somewhere that won't have the means to be able to lock it down?
Yeah, look, we have 200 years of history to look at. AI is not the first technology kind of or disruptive technology that showed up. We can go back to rail, the cotton gin, Gutenberg's printing press, the internet, the microprocessor. We could just keep going on and on. And each of these things seemed like it was going to be unbelievably disruptive. Every one of these technologies that's changed our life has really had two things in common. One, there was some kind of technological breakthrough that we could all talk about what needed to happen for the breakthrough to happen. But the second part is that somebody built an economic model oriented around profit that led to mass adoption. This is essentially true whether you are in China or the United States. It doesn't matter if your government is capitalistic and democratic or communistic, it makes no difference. Profit typically, historically, has been the driver. When we marry a technological breakthrough with a product that people want and need and can use in a way that enriches somebody, it tends to get adopted. And so, it's just, there aren't a lot of examples of governments or public efforts producing things that you love and rely on. Every single thing around you, literally everything you touch, your computer, your headset, your clothes, your shirt, pick a thing, was essentially created by for-profit enterprise and somebody who, built a faster way to make a bow tie a long time ago. Otherwise, people would be making them by hand. When they were made by hand, if in today's dollars, it would cost $692 for a bow tie or $1,600. Well, now we don't need that because all these advancements that allow you to just, do the things you and I do. So I think profit has a big piece here. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about that. There are other implications here that are problematic, and we could talk about the benefits of societal gain. And maybe there's a point where those conversations are really interesting and we should think about moving from kind of profit-oriented closed models to more open source models. But we're at a stage now where I think we should be encouraging anybody and everybody, open source models, closed source models, public companies, private companies, academic medical centers, diagnostic, whatever, to all attack this problem with everything we've got. Because on the other end, as we know, we had 600,000 patients die in the year 2025, 600,000 will die in 2026, 600,000 will die in 2027, plus or minus a few. So every time, we haven't yet broken this disease, and until we break it, I kind of feel like it's almost all hands on deck. Let's save 500,000 people a year from dying, and then talk about whether or not, like, how this should work. But I think for now, it's like any effort, every effort, any effort, every effort. If the government wants to get involved, great, whatever.
Yeah. To your point, if incentivization, itself can't, like, that allure hasn't gotten us there, like, then keep it going until at some point things are just so
very
nice.
hard to believe. Very hard to believe that somehow we could create an entirely non-capitalistic system that would allow us to eradicate cancer.
Right.
I actually think this is where America has an advantage. It has the most broken healthcare system in the world by far. It's insane. But the one thing it has going for it as it relates to cancer is that this Wild West, this crazy payment system that allows for innovation and freedom of choice, I think in today's day and age is the environment that will allow us to basically bring AI at scale to the first disease area where we will have massive impact. And we will save hundreds of thousands of people from dying. And then that'll become like the roadmap, both in the US for other disease areas and then internationally, to kind of change the trajectory of healthcare.
It is this calamity of messiness that I think, to your point, is the pressure cooker that will get us that rice, cooked like we need to be able to be, healthier, to have healthier lives. Well, Eric, this has been a total pleasure. We appreciate you immensely. Doug, I'm sure you feel the same. This is great. And it's a great note to leave on, because I think we lose sight of that. It's not always imagine something better. It's what is the alternative and what makes the most sense with what we have. And I think that's, this is a good illustration of that.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming, Eric. We appreciate your insights, man.
Anytime.